Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Anything can happen. Anything can happen. Trust me, anything can happen. One day people went to sleep thinking, the earth can't be destroyed and all human life eliminated from it. And the next day they woke up and found out, actually it can. It was a hard, weird day for people. We'll talk about it in this class. I don't know if the cover slide for this thing is going to give you any intention of it. Anyway, what's that thing? What's that thing they've got? Could be anything. Let's find out what it is. I mean, it's just a... okay, it says a bomb below that. It is a bomb. The peace bomb? That's weird. Let's talk about it. In the last lecture, we talked about the outbreak of World War II, the United States' decision to become involved. Well, the United States. Congress's decision to become involved with the declaration of war after Pearl Harbor. We talked about the events that went down in Europe. I kind of gave you a brief overview of major battles there. And where we wrapped up, you have May 8th, 1945. You have the end of the war in Europe. And the end of the war in Europe means the Nazis had surrendered. Hitler put a bullet in his head in a bunker. The Italians had surrendered a year before. But the war in Europe may be over, but the war in Japan, still going on. The war in Japan. Actually, the war in the entire Pacific, just about that way, and throughout Asia. So that's where we were when we left off last time. You may recall, December 7th, 1941, we are hit at Pearl Harbor and at the Philippines about the same time. That's kind of left out. But we are hit with these big attacks, and the Japanese think that they have managed to weaken us heavily. They have, but we're gonna figure out ways to turn this around. You have this brutal moment in April of 1942, the Bataan Death March, in which between there are 70 and 80,000 POWs taken by the Japanese in the Philippines, 5 to 11,000 deaths. These are mostly Filipinos. Right? This is, again, part of the United States at this point. They've been annexed as a territory. So the Japanese are there fighting us. The problem here with all of this becomes, how do you stop an enemy that doesn't care if they die? Because this nationalism and this is an ideology. Again, ideology is the way you see the world. That shapes things. For the Japanese, they would rather die in battle than they would be surrender and be taken prisoners of war, because they would be absolutely nobody after that. And it's this ideology that sets in there, and it is the racial superiority is there, just like it is in Nazism and Italian fascism. There is the drive to war is there, expansionism. But Nazis surrender. The Japanese, that's not part of their ideology. A couple of pretty bad years for the U.S. early on. The Japanese hit us quick. They've got, as I said, incredible pilots, great war machines, a navy that is powerful. And we are now trying to catch up with them. It's going to take time to get our war production ramped up. There are a couple of notable moments in 1942. The first one it's called the Doolittle Raid, and this is April 18th of that year. This isn't a huge turning point, but I think it's a pretty amazing act of heroism. Basically, a group of fighters, they fly in airplanes that, well, let me back up here. The Japanese have been on the offensive, and they have felt no pain at home from this war. So the United States starts thinking, how do we bring the war home to the Japanese? We can't get our carriers really close to in, because we're moving more and more into their territory. So a small group of U.S. pilots outfit planes as bombers. They decide to fly them across from way further out than the Japanese would ever expect and drop bombs on Tokyo. And the Japanese are not at all expecting this, because they've been winning this whole time, right? This is the next few months after Pearl Harbor. The United States is on its defense. These folks decide to fly planes and leave so far away the Japanese won't be worried about the carriers, because the Japanese know that these planes that could hit Japan, there's not enough fuel, right? Yeah, you can fly there, but you can never make it back to a carrier that far away. But the group of pilots in the Doolittle Raid, they decide to do it anyway. And they know they're not going to get back to the carrier. They devised a plan to fly over, drop bombs on Japan, and then crash land in China. China had been occupied by the Japanese, but China was a U.S. ally during the war. So when they're looking at doing this, they realize they're not going to get back. And they hope that they can crash land there, that Chinese people will help them out, and then that the Russians essentially can help them get out of the area because they're not far away. They do it. Some of them don't make it out. A lot of them do. But the Japanese punish the Chinese population in the areas where they crash landed. Thousands of people are killed in vengeance for supporting this. It's not a game changer in terms of the tide of the war, but it is, you see these acts of bravery, right? The Japanese will never see this coming, but will hit them and let them know that something might more happen, right? It's a psychological thing. The Japanese, on the other hand, this is a crazy story. The Japanese, oh man, I don't usually tell about this, but this story is insane. The Japanese took bombs and put them on weather balloons and floated them through the air currents from the Pacific because they knew that the air, like the Gulf Stream, they knew that it would carry those weather balloons. This is a long-term strategy. Carry the weather balloons down and across and over the United States. And some of them got there. It's a bizarre thing. Some of them didn't detonate, some of them did. But this was something that was kind of not really talked about. But yeah. So there's all these things going on that are just kind of like psychological, morale boosting, but morale breaking from the other side throughout this war. It's fascinating. The turning point, though, friends, the turning point comes June 3rd, 1942. And this is an all-in kind of make or break moment. It's the Battle of Midway. Throughout this war, all the countries are trying to crack the other side's code because they're transmitting things through the air. The signals can be picked up, but the question is, what are the codes they're using? What are the words they're using? And even some things, even within the code, they'll use code words to talk about places. By middle of 1942, the U.S. had intercepted and broken a lot of the Japanese code. The problem is, not all of it. And what the idea is, if they can break this code, they're hoping they can figure out some way to get the Japanese and catch them off guard. Well, this is crazy. So they know that an attack is coming because they've picked that up. But they don't know the code word. They don't know the place it's going to be. They think they know. But for this to work, it's going to be an all-in, everything at once strategy. If they pull the entire fleet one place to try to catch them off guard and it's the wrong place, the Japanese are going to be wide open to take more territory in the Pacific and get an advantage. So they think it's going to be Midway. But they trick the Japanese because they say, we think it's Midway Island. How could we be certain about that? And so what they do is the U.S. knows, and this is the crazy thing, sometimes you have a code that you know the enemy has broken, but you still use it as if you don't know to trick the enemy into falling for false information. The U.S. blasts out a notification saying that a main water, I think it was the water boiler at a base on Midway, had broken and they were completely without cold water. And they blasted out knowing that the Japanese would intercept it and that they would likely radio back this news that we could pick up. And so they said on Midway at this base, it has this water main is broken. Sure enough, the Japanese transmit in their code that the water main on this place is broken, and they're able to confirm that that is the place they're attacking. And the U.S. goes all in. The Japanese do not expect it. We're able to destroy a lot of their aircraft. We're able to take down some of their best pilots. And from this moment on, the Japanese are not going to be able to recover. They're going to be trying to catch up, trying to rebuild planes. But these pilots they've got, their best pilots have been training for years. They're aces. Once they're taken out, there's no training them and getting pilots that good back out there that quickly. So this is going to be knocking a leg out from underneath the Japanese. The problem is, how do you get them to surrender when that's not a concept that they even believe is real? This is the issue as the Allies meet to settle what's going to happen after World War II. So you've got the big three, the US, the UK, and the USSR. Right? And here's this great photograph. Churchill, FDR, and Stalin sitting together at Yalta. Yalta is this conference where they come together February of 1945. Now, they're already planning before this for, some type of a post-world order. And the US and the UK had already come together and brought in other countries and come to an agreement that they were going to reach the gold standard. So there's these things going on behind the scenes. Damn, messing this up. Okay. There had already been a meeting in July of 1945 to kind of work out the post-war order. You have the development at this Bretton Woods conference, which is held in the U.S. You have the development of a gold standard and of an international monetary fund and a World Bank, which is meant to help stabilize currencies, which had been a problem before the war, and also to help rebuild these countries. So they know the end's starting to come. But in terms of strategic interests, Yalta really matters. So they realize the Nazis are going to fall soon. And they got to work out what to do. Now, one of the questions here is, what is the Soviet Union going to do with Japan? Because the Soviet Union was at war with Germany. They were not at war with Japan. Nothing had happened between the two at this point. Some minor skirmishes. So do you want to get them involved? Okay. Well, we actually do. Because how do you beat that unsurrenderable force? Well, the Soviets, as I think I've pointed this out before, there is this area, right? The Soviet Union takes over what is Russia, which means they're right there near Japan on the Pacific coast. They got the Trans-Siberian Railroad built out there. They've got the Red Army built and ready to go. So having them on the side would help, especially because a lot of the resources coming into Japan are coming out of mainland Asia. The areas in China that they had taken over, the Japanese had taken over, Korea that the Japanese had taken over. So getting the Soviets in would have created a two-front war where they're fighting the United States in the Pacific and the Soviets on land in Asia. At this meeting, they work out a deal. Stalin agrees. All right, look, after the war is over, we will come in to this war. But in return, we don't want you messing with us. We want influence in northern China. And we want influence over these Japanese islands that we've been fighting with the Japanese over for years, that we both have claims on. We also want the Germans to have to pay back for the damages they caused us, post-war reparations. And they begin to agree on what's going to be a United Nations. This is kind of there. So you're seeing these sides work together, right? Even though you've got Stalin here, this guy is, going to turn out to be pretty tricky. You've got Churchill and FDR, seasoned statesmen, at this meeting, and this is the agreement they reach. In October of 1944, just before this, the U.S. had already taken back the Philippines. MacArthur's there, Douglas MacArthur. Remember the guy who was shooting at veterans on the White House lawn in 1932? He's back. He fulfilled his promise that he would return. He left during the Japanese invasion in 1942. The United States is making it through the islands, but the casualties are massive. So you got the Battle of Iwo Jima, which you've heard of, this famous photograph of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. In this war, in this battle, you have 70,000 U.S. Marines versus 18,000 Japanese soldiers. Okay? Pretty good odds for the United States. Should have been a quick victory. In the end, those 18,000 soldiers lead to 27,000 U.S. casualties. And by the time this battle is over, I told you the Japanese don't get taken POW. They fight till they die. At the end of this battle, there are only 216 of the 18,000 Japanese who were taken POWs. This is one of the interesting things about World War II, the veterans. Because there are those that served in Europe and there are those that served in the Pacific. And those that served in Europe, they saw horrible things. But a lot of people say that if you talk to the people in the Pacific, they were way less likely to want to tell you about the war. They kind of put it off. In fact, my wife's grandfather was there. Barely talked about it. He cared that he was a Marine, but he barely talked about it because of the things they saw. It was brutal. The United States then moves in where they can start hitting Tokyo. On March 9th, 1945, Tokyo is firebombed. It's a wooden city, so it burns. 300 bombers drop 500,000 cylinders of napalm on the capital. 100,000 civilians are killed. The Japanese not surrendering. April and June of 1945, you have the Battle of Okinawa. This is an island central to Japan. 287,000 allies now, 130,000 Japanese. In the end, 65,000 U.S. casualties, 77,000 Japanese casualties. The Japanese lose more than half, or casualties of more than half the soldiers that are there. And at this point, what have you got to take? You've destroyed their capital. You've seized most of the islands surrounding them. They don't really have a chance of winning. But you're looking at it saying, do we have to kill every single person in that country? It's a horrible thing to say. But it's a real concern. Because if they will not surrender, how do you end this war? Well, it turns out that already by this point, for a couple of years, there's been a secret project going on that's going to answer this question. It's called the Manhattan Project. The story goes like this. One of the things about the Nazis, there's lots of bad things about Nazis, but Nazis are pretty ridiculous, right? This again goes back to my whole thing that I'm telling you guys about. Be grateful that the United States does not have a bloodline version of belonging, because it's been good for us and bad for other people. So one of the things that happens when you are Hitler and you decide to, go after all the Jewish people is that, like, one of the guys who lived in Germany, a guy named Albert Einstein, is not going to stick around. Lots of great physicists and scientists are not going to stick around. Not just in Germany, but throughout Central Europe, places where the Nazis are going. If they can, they get the hell out. Now, not all of them can, and in fact, the United States is not completely open to immigration. Remember, we still got Johnson Reed. There's some modifications made, but overall, a lot of people would have liked to come here to escape what the Nazis were doing, and were not allowed to. So, but some were. One of the people who came here, again, Albert Einstein, but another one you probably never heard of, a guy named Leo Szilard. He was Hungarian Jewish. That being in a portion of the world where the Nazis were moving, came to the United States. Now, physics at this point is at a pretty fascinating moment. Scientists have been working with, they'd recently, in the last few decades, discovered the neutron, which changed the way that people understood atoms. But they'd also been doing experiments on, like, what happens if you send a neutron into the nucleus of another cell. In fact, a guy named Enrico Fermi had won the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering this and doing experiments on neutron bombardment, right, to see what happens. In fact, Enrico Fermi had won the Nobel Prize. He was living in Italy. He was an Italian physicist. Genius. He had gone off to study, actually, in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany with the great physicists in Germany. He didn't really shine there. Came back to Italy. But he was married to a Jewish woman. He saw what was happening. So Enrico Fermi goes to accept the Nobel Prize in Physics and secretly catches a plane and heads to the United States too. So all these folks are here. This guy Leo Szilard, the story he tells, that one day he's sitting at a stoplight and something just clicks. He said he realizes that if it were possible to create the right conditions, neutrons could be fired at the nucleus of an atom. That could cause a chain reaction and cause the atom to split into two. And each one of those two then releases one neutron. So you've got two neutrons now. And those two could hit two more. And he realizes there could be an exponential effect that created a weapon unlike Earth has ever seen. He also realizes that even though he's not sure if this is possible, he knows that if it is, the Nazis are already working on it. They got the best physicists in the world, including one you might have heard of through Breaking Bad, Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg. It's like the genius physicist in Nazi Germany. So Leo Szilard is terrified about this. But you ever heard of Leo Szilard? Probably not. But if you have, you heard about what he did later on. You didn't know who he was back then. But you guys ever heard of Albert Einstein? Yes, you have. Leo Szilard knows who he is. He knows who Einstein is. And he takes this idea to Einstein. Einstein's already a celebrity in his own time. He goes to Einstein and is like, look, you and I both know that if this is possible, and theoretically it might be, the Nazis are going to get it. And if they get it before somebody else does, it's over. Einstein then uses his celebrity to get this information to FDR. FDR believes him, and hence you have the beginning in January of 1942, the creation of one of the most insane top secret projects. I mean, I would say this country has ever seen, but who knows what's happening right now. Don't get all conspiracy, okay? But it's crazy. The Manhattan Project. This is a project to begin experiments and ultimately the completion of a weapon on the basis of this principle of nuclear division. Again, the prominent figures here, one of them is Enrico Fermi. I love Enrico Fermi. This guy's a genius, like kind of like an amazing, like the things that he comes up with are just genius, and he's practical too. So the first step you got to do is you got to figure out if this is possible. Can you actually create a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction? Right? Can you send those neutrons in? Boom. Fermi's the guy who had experimented with constantly with neutron bombardment. So they give him a lab. And they say, all right, run these experiments. But you don't want anyone to know that it's happening. Because what if, you've got spies constantly. You've got spies throughout the United States. For the Germans, for the Japanese, you got them everywhere. So, let's say they didn't know this was possible. And then they find out that this research is happening. You might spark some knowledge from another country. So it's got to all be done under complete secrecy. So it's all got to be done under complete secrecy. The University of Chicago, very prominent university. Guess where? That's right, in Houston. Just kidding, it's in Chicago, obviously. That university had recently ended its football program. They had canceled it. Michigan State later will replace them in what becomes the Big Ten. But they then have a football stadium. It's not really being used. And Fermi follows that logic that you had in middle school. I don't know if you guys ever went to a basketball game or a football game when you were in middle school and you'd be running around. And if you and your friends wanted to get away with being goofy and stuff that you want your parents to see, what would you do? You'd go into the bleachers, wouldn't you? Yup. No one looks under the bleachers. So they construct a lab, start carrying these out under the bleachers at the University of Chicago, under the stadium there. Fermi goes in. And Fermi is considered by most people to be the last great theoretical and practical physicist. Right? He's applied. And he creates this great apparatus. And he demonstrates that you can, in fact, create a self-sustaining chain reaction. The thing he realizes is you've got to use graphite. Because you need the neutron to go the perfect speed through the nucleus to create the chain reaction you want. If it goes too fast, it won't work. If it goes too slow, it won't work. It's got to be the perfect speed. In graphite, if you go neutrons through graphite, it puts it at the speed you need. Settle. Once they realize this, they need the types of materials that you need to create this, to the most unstable. And what they figure out is it's got to be uranium. But uranium's in short supply. Fortunately, they figure out where to get enough of it to do this experiment. One of the things they do, beginning in 1942, and you ever heard of Oak Ridge, Tennessee? Oak Ridge, Tennessee was nothing in 1940. The U.S. Army builds Oak Ridge, Tennessee out of the ground as one of the places that produces what they need to make the atomic weapons. And that place is on lockdown. I believe it's 58,000 people that move into this town. It becomes Tennessee's largest metropolitan area if it were on a map, but it's not. Go back and look at maps of 1945. It doesn't show up on the map because it's totally secret. Most of the people working there did one thing and had no clue what they were actually working on. At Hanford, Washington, they began building a facility to turn uranium into plutonium. This place is, to this day, through the roof. It's like the cancer rates there are like more than double what the average is. We'll talk more about Hanford later on. It's shotgunned. It's built fast to make this stuff because this all has speed. And you think about it from that perspective. Once you realize this is possible, once you realize the magnitude of this weapon, are you going to wait? They say no. And this guy, Leslie Groves, who later on writes his memoirs, Now It Can Be Told, about this, constantly talking about, he's the military officer who's affiliated with this, constantly talking about the need for speed, and that pushed on people. And then finally,
the fireball starts out at about 1,000,000 degrees, which means the only radiation coming off of it is X-rays, and you can't see it. It's not producing visible light. And it's only after it cools down, which it does very rapidly, to about 10,000 degrees, the temperature of the surface of the sun, that it suddenly blazes into light. And then, because it's far enough away not to kill you, you just see the explosion. You don't hear the sound. You don't feel the blast. It's just this thing happening in silence. And then abruptly, the sound bursts over your face, and the shockwave blows dust and leaves and sand in your face. And the physical wave is such that it shakes the ground as it goes by you and resonates in your chest cavity.
Well, our first reaction was, we've done it. And it was even more powerful than we had previously calculated. The second thought was, what a horrible gadget have we invented. There was a strong feeling. What next? It'd be much more than a fireball.
Those were scientists who worked on the project. If you go back and you read their accounts, in the moment of World War II, under the pressure, hello? Check. Okay, cool. Under the pressure of World War II, the realization that the Nazis got it first, it was all over. The realization that they were working on something for their country and to win this brutal war. All of these, and then the mentality of scientists. Can you do this? Can you harness this power? They get wrapped up in it. And a lot of them later on, they wonder if they did the right thing. Nevertheless, it's there. The atomic bomb. In the end, it turns out, guys, that the Nazis had thought about doing this project, and they had begun this project to create an atomic bomb. But they had failed. We start finding this news out after Germany surrenders. They had experimented with it. They had the idea they could create this weapon. They had the physicists to do it and the facilities to build this thing. But they messed up. Remember I told you need graphite? You need graphite to make it work. That's the material. That's the mediator. They had used impure graphite when they ran their experiments. And it gave them wrong data. The data that the Nazis had led them to believe that, yes, you could create this weapon, this uranium bomb, but that it would be so expensive and even so hard to find that much uranium that you could create one, but the chances of this being anything more than a one-time thing, pretty slim. In other words, not worth it. We did something different. First of all, the experiments that Fermi did were more precise. They gave us the idea that we could possibly produce more than one out of uranium. But the advanced stage was turning uranium into plutonium. That process yields a lot more plutonium. So you're using uranium to create way more nuclear fuel. That's what that Hanford site does up in Washington. It's a very, very, very toxic process. But we did it. And we kind of knew this when we were going into it, that the Nazis thought that there could only be one. So on August 6, 1945, the U.S. is going to make a pretty big decision. A few months before this, FDR died in office. And the guy who takes over, and this is another interesting thing, when you look at multi-term presidents, a lot of times they get a new vice president in the term that they're running, and then they die in office and leave with the new, less seasoned vice president. This happens with Abraham Lincoln, who ran with Andrew Johnson his second term. It happened with Teddy Roosevelt and when McKinley died. And then it happens again here. FDR, as popular as he was, the Democratic strength was starting to wane a little bit in the middle of this war. And so he decided to move away from his previous vice president and to appoint a senator from Missouri named Harry Truman. Harry Truman had very little experience on the international stage. He was kind of put on the ticket to try to appeal to a semi-southern state. When he is sworn into office, he has no clue about the Manhattan Project. This is how secret it was. The Vice President of the United States, the guy who, as it turns out, is going to be the guy with the keys to this thing, if the president dies, this news is dropped on him. In the end, he decides to have it dropped. August 6, 1945, the U.S. drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, drops a bomb on Nagasaki. One day, you went to sleep thinking the idea that all of humanity could be destroyed in a relatively short period of time, thinking that would just be something out of a science fiction novel. Then you wake up the next day and you find out that everything's changed. Human beings have harnessed the power of atoms, things you can't even see, turned it into one of the most destructive devices ever created. The sixth, the first bomb, 3 days later, the second bomb. This is an interesting story. That's not much time. Now imagine this. No one believed that this weapon was possible, except for a couple of physicists who were like, yeah, you might be able to make one, whatever. You drop one. The reason that you drop them is debated. Now, there is the case, as I made earlier. It is clear that from an officer standpoint in the military, your job is to minimize the casualties on your side. Okay, dropping these bombs, for all the horrors it might unleash on the world, saves your men's life. Told you about what these soldiers had seen. I told you that the Japanese don't surrender. And so from a military standpoint, there is this calculation. So that matters. On the other hand, you just unleashed this weapon on the world. And then you say, hey, yeah, you know what happened? That was all from one bomb that we've got. Are you going to believe that? Like if I told you guys I could shoot lasers out of my eyes and I did it one time, would you believe it? Or would you be like, I don't know, man. I think I saw things that couldn't possibly be true. But if I do it a second time, guess what? Now you've seen it twice. We don't even give the Japanese time to investigate the reality of these claims. They were stark. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were both decided as targets. The reason they were picked was because they were not strategic points. Tokyo had been firebombed. A lot of the major cities have been firebombed. They were already in shambles. You drop an atomic bomb on those places, just go, well, they were already destroyed. I guess it didn't do that much damage. But they pick Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they're just towns that have really little, no significance. They haven't been destroyed. They pick those towns to demonstrate exactly what the bomb can do. 3 days later, before allowing the Japanese to really wrap their heads around this, a second one was dropped. Why so quick? Well, remember what I told you? I told you that the Nazi scientists had reached the conclusion that maybe you could build one, but more than one would be unlikely. You drop two real quick to make sure that the Nazis, they don't matter as much anymore, but we don't know what they've passed on to the Japanese physicists. Even they look at what happened to Hiroshima and they could be like, don't worry about it, there won't be another one. Boom, boom, you drop the second one, and that lets everyone know, hey, we've got more than one of these, and we'll use them quick. It's a demonstration of your arsenal and your ability to produce more. But why does Japan need to see that? Why do you want to do it so fast? The answer is, at least partially, because you're not showing this weapon to Japan. You're showing this weapon to Stalin. Because the Soviets had invaded the same places we invaded. They were poaching the scientists as well. They were capturing scientists and talking to them. Stalin showing pretty clear that he was not going to leave Eastern Europe. Truman and Stalin do not get along. They meet in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, and as we'll talk the next time, Truman has absolutely nothing good to say to Stalin. Whereas FDR had been like, we got to work with this guy. Truman's like, I don't trust him. He's our enemy. He's not leaving Eastern Europe. He's probably going to be a thorn in our side after the war. Now, these are our allies, remember. These are allies who, at this point, are helping us fight the Japanese. So you drop the second one 3 days later to make sure the Japanese don't surrender before you get a chance to make that point. That's one part of it. Another part of it is ending the war quickly. Not just to save American lives, but also because of Stalin. The Soviets had opened an offensive against the Japanese in China. And they were making headway. They had pushed them back through Manchuria. And at this point that this was going down, they had worked their way all the way to the Korean Peninsula and occupied the northern part of it. And the next step after taking the entire Korean Peninsula was going to be jump to a land offensive in Japan. Truman is looking at Europe and seeing that the Soviets had come across Poland, Czechoslovakia. They had already annexed Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. If you don't stop Stalin from his offensive with the Soviets, and you're Truman, you're worried that what's going to end up happening is that the Soviets are going to pull the same thing in Asia that they pulled in Europe, trying to expand their dominance, trying to expand their power, so that Stalin and the Soviet Union can have a buffer zone around him, which is actually something that Stalin is concerned about. So on September 2nd, after all this, the Japanese surrender. Called an end to fighting a little bit before that. Now, for all of the boneheaded decisions that Truman's going to make in this post-war era, that's going to contribute to creating a international rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, he was right about that thing in Asia. Because you guys can look at a map today and see about how far down the Korean Peninsula the Soviets got. It's the border between North and South Korea. Stalin did just as Truman had expected. They occupy the northern part, and they say, we're going to deal with the rebuilding here. The U.S. takes the southern part. And you guys aren't going to believe this, but in the northern part of Korea, this is going to be crazy. The northern part of Korea, a government comes to power that is very loyal to Stalin. Crazy, huh? You're kind of like us in Panama. I wouldn't even believe that. You send your army in, and suddenly the government that pops up is on your side. And the southern part is going to be loyal to the United States. You dropped the second bomb because if they had gotten further, who knows what would have happened. Some scholars also argue that race matters in this. That the Americans could drop the bomb so kind of easily on Japan because of American notions of Asian people. Now, you guys have certainly seen that racism exists, not directly towards the Japanese. And you've seen the Asians being excluded from the Immigration Act, Johnson Reed. You already had the first Immigration Act of 1882 aimed at keeping Chinese people out. You saw the way that Albert Beveridge and William McKinley depicted Filipino people and Asian people in general. That expands to them as well. There are definitely racist notions against the Asian people that are not against Europeans. And if you don't believe that, even right now, ask yourself, could you imagine an atomic bomb being dropped on Berlin? So all these come together. They lead to this bomb. Changes the world. It also sets the marker for what's going to happen moving forward at the international level. But as all this is going on abroad, you guys should probably be prepared for this because we talked about this in World War I. Things are happening back home. The war creates massive changes and massive experiences that people go through that are going to shape the country for a long time. One of them has to do with internment. People who are held in captivity are moved to places because of this war. Now, in our sessions on next week, our in-class sections that we meet when we wait a second. Now, next week in our class meetings, we're actually going to have a guest talk by Harliana Burns, your graduate assistant, who is going to talk about the German POWs who were captured and sent to the United States to camps. And they were throughout the South, even in Tennessee. There were German POWs who were brought here to be held. Also, some Nazi scientists who end up getting slipped into the United States to work on our programs. Werner von Braun Center in Huntsville. Go read about that guy. Werner von Braun, part of our space program. Might talk about that more later. So you have people being brought into the country, right? You have refugees coming here. Remember, Einstein's Allard. It brings in these incredible scientists to the United States. But at home, these racial notions that I just told you about Asian people, they're going to heavily impact Japanese Americans. During the war, this is shortly after Pearl Harbor, a little over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, FDR passes Executive Order number 9066, February 19th, 1942. This is an executive order to round up Japanese people, Japanese Americans, right? Not Japanese citizens, most of them. People of Japanese ancestry, Americans, and put them in internment camps. About 120,000 Japanese Americans are forced to leave behind their homes, their businesses. Most of these folks are living in the Southwest, primarily California. They leave in a government order, and they're sent to camps across the country where they can be monitored, where they can be, and the idea of the government is to keep them away from anything important, because the idea is that simply by being of Japanese origin, they might be on the side of Japan in this war. These folks are Americans. There were a few things against German Americans, a few things against Italian Americans, not much. But German Americans aren't rounded up and sent into camps. Italian Americans are not. Only Japanese Americans. These are concentration camps. And I want to make clear here that there is a difference between a concentration camp in its true definition and what the Nazis built. The purpose of a concentration camp, and we use that term to refer to the camps in Nazi Germany, but it has an actual meaning. A concentration camp is where you concentrate a portion of the population in one place. By taking Japanese Americans from across the country and moving them into places, they are concentrating those populations to observe them. Therefore, that is a concentration camp. Now, the Nazis built camps that, by this definition, are concentration camps. But I think sometimes we lose the real horror of what happens. It's different in Germany. Japanese Americans weren't killed. They weren't held in cages. They were just required to live here. Now, they lost. I mean, there was reparations for this in the 1990s, finally, because these folks lost their livelihoods. I'm not in any way trying to diminish this, but I want to explain to you what the concentration camps that we call in Germany were. They were death camps. People were not supposed to get out of those. The horror of the death camps the Nazis built is that they move people in there. And they don't just move them in there to kill them. That's part of the plan. But they tell the Jewish people that if they work hard, building the things that the Nazis needed to keep the war going, if they worked hard, eventually they'd be set free. In fact, Auschwitz, I can't remember which one of the concentration camps, but it has over the gate in German, "Work shall set you free." They tell them that if they work, they will prove their loyalty. And then when they become too feeble to work, they're executed. At the very end of the war, once the Nazis realize that things are turning, they just begin gassing people en masse and killing them. But I feel like the horror of the Nazi concentration camps, that a lot of us, we're told they're death camps, okay, we're told whatever, but imagine this. Imagine that you are taken in to a camp and promised that if you work, you'll be set free. You're separated from your family a lot of the time. Imagine how hard you'd work if you believed that would allow you to see your kid or to see your parents again. They're worked to death. And the product of their labor, the materials required to keep the Nazi war machine moving forward so that it can continue to do this to more and more Jewish people across Eastern Europe. I remember not knowing much about this story when I first started college and seeing a map of Europe and realizing that I looked at it and I looked at the map of the Jewish population in Germany, and I remember hearing 6 million people were killed in the Holocaust and looking at the map and saying, but there were less than 1 million people in Germany at the time. And my professor saying, yeah, that's because they took this death camp with them where they went. They were pushing across Europe, bringing in Jewish people and murdering them. To find out that you worked at a camp that fueled that, possibly your relatives in another part of Europe. The horror of it. People lose a lot. I also don't mean to take this down even further, but this is far from the first time the Jewish people are made a target in history. Throughout Europe for hundreds of years before this, when things turned down, the economy turned bad, something happened bad in the country, they were scapegoats. Because they were outsiders to people. One day I hope we figure this out. One day I hope we figure out to be too smart to fall for these things. But I still hear anti-Semitic conspiracy theories going around. Being caught by the same trap that's caught people over and over again. History's pretty useful, being too smart for it. So hopefully you're listening. But the boom back home is going to change things. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. government spends twice as much money as the country has spent in its entire existence before that. 16 million Americans serve in the armed forces during World War II, and business and government become very close. All of this is going to change the United States. You've already seen how the experience abroad is going to change it. Next time we will talk about exactly how the world you know and the middle class is created by the post-World War II era and the policies of the federal government. That's it for today. Have a great day. Be too smart to fall for racism, guys, for God's sakes. Have a great day. Thank you.